Seneca Waugh with your Clear Next Step. Today is Friday, the 22nd of May, and I want to thank you for being part of today's conversation on Friday Connections. This is Seneca Waugh with your Clear Next Step, and these Friday Connections are part of our ongoing mission to help people have better work days so that we can all have better evenings and better weekends, and what better weekend to do that than a holiday weekend coming up. So in support of this particular day, as we're transitioning, many of us have been in this COVID-19 quarantine situation for 8 or 9 weeks, kind of depending on where it started or when it started for you. And the world is starting to open up again. There are changes, there are things being opened and people participating in new places and new ways. And many of us are going to try to find what our new normal looks like for the workday and the workplace. Schools are coming to a close and ending there. This is also Memorial Day weekend, which means that for many Americans, there is a somber feel on our hearts in honor and in recognition of those who gave their lives for our country. So the topic of today, while it's not particularly uplifting in and of itself, I think it has some real value to us right now. And the topic is grief and grieving. The reality is grief and grieving is something that we will all experience at one time or another, and it has the potential to impact us, right? It has the potential to impact our interactions with one another. And so I have a colleague who has been really careful over the years to help me talk about how to stay in my lane. And our lane at Your Clear Next Step is helping people have better work days. And I think the way this ties in is in our concept around emotional intelligence and being aware of your emotions and being aware of what's going on for you so that you can interact well with others and you can go through your workday as effectively as possible and have better evenings and better weekends. The exposure that I've had to grief and to understanding the science of grief and grieving has been through my exposure to change management. So I teach a lot of classes in change management, and for many, many years, we've talked about change as a grieving process, right? You grieve the loss of the one as you move to the other. And so Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is an authority in this space, and she certainly is one of the experts that I am familiar with and aware of. And she, in the human resources aspect, we talk about the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the EKR method of change management, which treats change, sort of all change is like a death. And so we go through these stages. And for years, we talked about 5 stages of grieving, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross added somewhat more recently than her text in 1969. She added 2 more stages of grief. She wrote a book in 1969 called On Death and Dying, and it continues to be one of the best resources for understanding the grieving process. But one thing that I found really interesting in my research about this is that when she wrote that book, it was about the stages of grieving were originally about those patients who were grieving. The patients who had a terminal illness were grieving the loss of their own lives and the end for them. And so the stages of grieving that she talked about in that were really targeted towards them. And then it expanded to the patients' families and friends and loved ones. And then we've continued to expand it to lots of other places. So that is I am not in any way an expert in this. I'm aware of it, and I've done just the littlest bit of understanding of it so that I can help people through the process of grief that is associated with change management. There was another interesting piece in Psychology Today a couple of years back that pointed out that with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's approach, one of the things we need to be really, really careful of is the reality that we are still human and that we don't all process grief in the same way. And even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did not mean to say that we go through our phases, right? You do shock for 4 hours and then denial for 8 hours and then anger for 2 days and then bargaining for a day and a half and then depression. And no, that's not how it works, right? We don't go through those stages that way. But it is a process, and that you might be able to bounce in and out of those different stages and go through them and skip over some, and that's okay too. But knowing what those phases are, the phases of shock, of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, testing, and acceptance, understanding those and knowing that they have names and they have words is really, really valuable, because by putting words to our emotions, we can shape them and we can process them and we can move forward with them and not overreact to them or not underreact to them, not squelch them, not hide them, and not allow them to manifest themselves in unproductive ways. So right now in our transitional moment, we will all have something to grieve. And at some point in your life, you'll have something to grieve. But in this moment of transition, there are a lot of people who are grieving a lot of things. Tools like the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross method are helpful because they give us words and give us names to manage our grief. And it's likely that your grief will include some level of shock or denial, some level of sadness, and eventually, if it's the process, it'll probably lead to some level of acceptance. And that would be true for your grief as well as someone else. But other than those broad generalizations, I think we need to know that we're all different. In the change management classes, one of the things I talk about that has gotten just a lot of attention over the years is the difference between a pre-griever and a post-griever. And a pre-griever is someone who grieves in anticipation of the sad. You know the sad thing is coming, and so you grieve in advance of the sad. And a post-griever is someone who grieves after the sad has happened. So an example, on a normal year, you might have the senior year of high school, and a pre-griever grieves throughout the senior year of high school. It's our last football game, it's the last homecoming, it's the last Christmas ball, it's the last prom, oh, it's the last spring concert. And they grieve through those lasts of the senior, and then they drop the kid off at college and move on with their lives, and all is well. The post-griever might go through the whole senior year without batting an eyelash, just enjoying and soaking in every moment, drop the kid off for college, drive home, and then spend a year grieving. Oh, do you remember when our student was home and we went to football games? Do you remember the homecoming? Do you remember the winter dance? Do you remember prom? Remember when we used to do these things? And they might grieve in that process after the sadness happened, after that separation. Why this matters is because if you're in an organizational context with more than one person, you're all going through a grief together, you're all grieving the same thing, the duration of your grief is going to begin with the earliest tier of the earliest pre-griever, and it will continue until the last tier of the latest post-griever. This is really, really profound. There will be moments where you will say, if you are a pre-griever, you will say, I'm done with this. Why are we still sad about this? And someone else is just starting their grieving process. And being aware of that disconnect is so powerful if we're going through something together. It's part of why when we talk about organizational changes and paradigm shifts at the massive organizational level, it can take up to 7 years to process. So I know of an organization where their entire IT team, their infrastructure team, no longer is going to be reporting into the office anymore. They're all a work from home group. Now that is a pretty profound change, and it may take up to 7 years for that shift to really feel comfortable to the organization because of the duration of how long it takes people to grieve. So why does it matter? Right now, we've got a lot to grieve. There are things that are, there's loss of life, there are injuries, there is sickness, there is definitely missed opportunities. There are things to grieve. And then there are things that to you or me might not seem less sad, but to the individual going through them are profoundly sad as well. And I think it's really important that we recognize that our feelings are our feelings and we can't take them away from other people. If you are having feelings, they are your feelings, and it's not up to me to decide whether they're valid or not. They're your feelings, and my feelings are my feelings. And so when you're going through this period right now, if someone is acting out of character, like if something is really weird, they're out of character for what you usually know to them, and you can recognize it as maybe they're frozen in tracks, or maybe they're bargaining in an unusual way, or they're doing something. Ask yourself if it's grief. If you are doing something out of character, if you find yourself paralyzed, not really sure what to do next, or sad and unable to manage that, ask yourself, is it grief? If you or someone else are going through grief, the things I want you to remember are these 3 very simple things. 1, there is no one way to do grief, which means you're not wrong. Whatever way you're doing it, you're not wrong. Try to be productive, try not to be harmful to others, but there is no one way to go through grief. You don't have to follow the process or do the checklist. That's not what it is. Your feelings are your feelings, but it's a process, and we should be able to get through it. The second is it's a process, which means it takes time. You cannot expect for yourself or for someone else to grieve instantaneously and then have it be back to normal. It is a process, and it will take some time. And the third, and perhaps the most powerful, is the truth that grief is really very personal, which means it's a chance for us to connect as humans. We could use this grief opportunity as a chance to see into the soul of someone else. If someone is grieving, you could look them in the eye and connect with them and be that person who loves on them and lifts them up and encourages them and supports them, or just sits with them and listens. You'll be able to learn what's important to them and what matters to them. These moments of grief are not times to tear each other down or to belittle each other or to separate ourselves. These are opportunities that we can really shine by building good relationships and connecting with others.